Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next edition of The Coaches Are In. In this web series, each time I invite a guest coach and friend to the show to talk about a specific topic. And this time, we're going to be talking about inclusive leadership. So today, I have fellow coach Sarah Scala here joining me. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Thank you for being willing to do this. I know that today's topic is something that you talk about and coach and train on a lot. So I'm really excited to get into some questions for you that I hear all the time on this topic. So I think it'll be really helpful for folks who are watching to hear this conversation about how we handle these topics as they come up. So I think the best way to start, Sarah, is to just ask you, how do you define inclusion and inclusive leadership?
Well, inclusion at the end of the day is our practice of creating environments, cultures, spaces where people feel valued, respected, and that they can contribute fully. And this is beyond, mere diversity, ensuring, all voices are heard and that they're also considered when in regard to making decisions. When we look at inclusive leadership, this is a leadership style and it seeks to value people's different perspectives, insights, ideas, and backgrounds. And this involves recognizing and appreciating the differences on the team, whether they're culture, gender, age, sexual orientation, veteran status, education level, all of these pieces. But if you're practicing inclusive leadership, you're striving to create an environment where people feel valued, empowered, and understood.
Yeah, we often hear about, oh, you want to be authentic when you go to work. You want to be able to bring your whole self to work. And it really is so true when you really talk to people. Not everyone is able to do that. And it's it's there. You just mentioned many different aspects of how we're all beautifully different, and the life experiences and backgrounds and cultures and identities and everything that we bring. There's just such a wonderful diversity of humans out there, and it's just, to me, very sad that someone would feel that they can't bring them whole selves to work, but it happens more than we think.
It absolutely does. And folks saying bring your whole self to work is a position, we are often in a position of privilege and power when
Hmm.
we share that statement, supporting just what you've said, that not everyone feels safe or secure or comfortable bringing their whole self to work, which is why I think 30 to 40% of people cover or hide parts of who they really are, whether it's orientation, disability, neurodivergence, and
Hmm.
all of these pieces in the recipe that makes us us. It's easy for me, a white, financially stable woman who has a high level of education to say, yeah, bring your authentic self to work. But if my nationality or my background may not have as much privilege, it may actually be threatening. So that's
Right.
important to think about.
Yeah, definitely. Well, listen, on that note, like, what are some examples of inclusive leadership practices that leaders can model or use or lean on to help more people feel like they can be themselves at work, or feel more included, or feel more of a sense of belonging in their organization?
Great question. So, creating safe spaces really falls in the hands, first and foremost, of leaders and managers. And I do a lot of work teaching, speaking, coaching around psychological safety at work,
Hmm.
which is the key ingredient for exceptional performance. And the leader's job every day is to enforce psychologically safe teams, to support it, to set a good example. So, always creating that safe space. Also, being able to provide learning and development opportunities so that folks can understand different biases that they may have. Everyone has biases, myself included.
Sure.
And so helping people to see and understand that bias or which biases folks have and how that contributes to their involvement with their teams and with their organization is pretty important as well.
Yeah, one of the workshops that I do on inclusive leadership, there's a module on, privilege, bias, and power. And a lot of people never have a conversation about themselves and they never hear others. And it's always such a wonderful experience when the group really gets honest and transparent and vulnerable and talks about it. And it's just I love that moment in that workshop because it's transformative for people to really see themselves and then see others as well. And then like you can see the light bulb go off like, oh wow, I do have power there. Or oh wow, I never realized that you, who I've known for 8 years, have felt that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So being aware again of these biases, practicing active or deeper levels of listening is
Hmm.
also pretty critical for leaders, in addition to having some empathy, like you just shared.
Right. Listen, I want to ask you this question because I actually hear this question a lot. And well, I'll just ask you it. How do you address resistance or pushback when there's a leader or a team member who may not fully embrace inclusive practices for whatever reason that they have not to embrace it?
Great question. So sometimes I get pushback from the C suite. So when someone's heard me speak or have worked with me and now want me to do more work for their organization, it's very common for executives or the C-suite to say, "Whoa, whoa, whoa! We already do this. We are very
Mm,
inclusive." And there was some interesting research done by Accenture a few years back, and they did a study where they measured how inclusive executives think their organizations were. And in the
mhm,
US, it was a stunning 98% of leaders felt their companies were inclusive. 98%. But
mhm.
then they asked the same question to their employees, and only about 80% felt that their companies and cultures were inclusive. And so folks may hear, oh, 98 versus 80, that's pretty close, but it's almost a 20%
Yeah,
gap. And then because they're a censure, they ran the numbers. And these are 2020 figures. So we know that everything costs more now due to
right.
inflation. But in 2020, this was costing businesses 1.05 trillion with a T dollars
With a
in
T.
opportunity, trillion with a T, and that's just US. Obviously, the study includes data from other countries. But when I start talking an opportunity cost in the trillions, CEOs and leaders tend to have a change of perspective. So
Right.
it's not just a nice to have to constantly be building and reinforcing inclusive teams and cultures at work, but it has a direct, immediate impact on bottom line and on business numbers, whether it's their ability to hire new high potential talent,
Mhm.
retain the people that they do have, or having folks that are less represented being picked out or called upon to be promoted. And so that's where that 1.05 t trillion dollar cost comes from. It's the people side.
Yeah.
Also, people don't want to do business with a company that has a reputation of being discriminatory or
Mhm.
lacking inclusion. So I think back in the day, folks were like, oh, this diversity stuff, that's a nice to have. Yes, and it's a business critical, essential piece to bottom line financials as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I like that you were able to bring some numbers to that because people it's I think that's another thing that I think people who are serious about inclusion and want to do these things in their business. I think also sometimes folks who are responsible for it find measuring it daunting.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how can when you're cultivating an inclusive culture, like what maybe
Yeah.
can you look at to measure the progress of those initiatives so that you can show what it's actually doing for the company and for the people?
So when we look at how do we measure the effect, what's the ROI, return on investment of investing in inclusion, whether it's learning and development, whether it's coaching, whether it's changes in policies, there's a number of different ways. We can look at employee surveys and we can have
Mhm.
questions about inclusion and belonging, whether it's their engagement surveys, annual surveys, where they're anonymous, but we can get a pulse check on what folks are feeling about work. We can also look at diversity metrics that might be used for hiring, promotion, and retention. In addition, we can try to have feedback channels where we're getting ongoing feedback about employees, but also how employees think the organization can improve and be stronger. And then, last but not least, performance reviews. Are we including inclusivity as a criteria for
Mm.
leaders? Are they
Mhm.
being measured on that? I know, over the past few years they were. Now, politically, there's been a bit of
Right.
pushback against DEIB. But at the end of the day, if companies say, leaders, one of your jobs is to build inclusion, and it's part of their performance review, that's what gets measured. And, as Peter Block says, what gets measured gets managed. And that could impact leaders and their compensation. So,
Mhm.
those are just some things when I think about what I suggest or work with clients on when it comes to measuring that impact. Those are some of the pieces to
Yeah,
that.
great. Oh, thanks for sharing that. That's great. One more question for you on this topic, and this is one I've actually heard from someone last week. How do you respond when a leader talks about diversity being about quotas and not about hiring the right person for the job?
Yeah, so when I get resistance or pushback, especially from leaders that don't necessarily fully embrace inclusive practices, couple of things. First and foremost, I listen. I have to listen a lot to understand why they're resisting and what their perspectives are. Also, learning and development, again, as we've already spoken about, can help build awareness, not only about biases that we all have. Everyone has biases, myself included,
Hmm.
but also I find helping people see the bottom line impact to companies, teams, and cultures that are lacking in inclusion, and how
Mm.
that not only affects how it feels to work on their team or on their company, but the business's financial performance and possibly their incentives or compensation can often help to shift. It's not an overnight snap of finger, folks are now believers,
Right.
but I find learning and development often helps. In addition to this, if we have executives or the C suite that's leading by example,
Hmm.
that can be huge as well because everyone thinks, what are the bosses doing? It's one thing to say things, but
Right.
I think behavior speaks really loud. So, what are they doing? What examples are they showing? How are they navigating some hurdles or challenges when it comes to inclusion to
Right.
paint an example of what's expected?
Great. So, listen, if we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to ask you to tell the folks how they can find out more about you and your work in this space specifically, but what thoughts would you like to leave our folks with today? Those are who are sitting here saying, okay, I get it. I want to make sure that my people feel that they can bring them whole selves to work and are respected for their differences
Mhm.
and all of that. What final words do you want to leave our folks with, or maybe what's one thing that a leader can do today
Yeah.
to take a small steps toward making their cultures more inclusive?
So when we look at folks' takeaways from our chit chat today, Michael, it's never too late to start. Yesterday is the best day to have started, but today and tomorrow are the second best. And so we don't need to beat ourselves up for not feeling like we are the champion of inclusion at our company. We could start making small steps. We can do this by trying to learn more about differences,
Mhm.
especially folks who are less represented. We can try to understand our biases. We can work on being a leader that supports psychological safety at work. And
Mhm.
so, those are definitely some of the simple ways. Just take small steps. People are going to notice.
Right.
And also, not being afraid of not being perfect. Telling your team,
Yes.
"Hey, I just
Yes.
became more aware of this topic. This is something I want to work on myself." So
Right.
showing a little vulnerability, but I want us all to be supporting each other in the team or in the company. So not being afraid to say, hey, I'm not an expert at this.
Right. And that goes back to what you were talking about modeling behavior, because I do see, even in my work in this space, that some people are just afraid to make a mistake and say the wrong thing. So then they're paralyzed and they don't move forward, making things more inclusive for folks. And that's not helping anyone. And if you show up with the in your heart wanting to make people belong, make people feel respected, respect differences, and you're demonstrating a culture where it's okay to get it wrong and learn and talk about it so that you can then be better. When your people see that, they give you grace for the mistake. They're more likely to speak up and say, hey, you said that in the meeting, and I just want to let you know how that made me feel. They're more likely to do that. So then
Yep, exactly. And
Yeah.
there's one resource that I frequently point people to, and it's a book called How to Be an Inclusive Leader, and it's in its second edition. And
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer Brown, who's well known globally for her work in supporting inclusion and belonging, has written this book. So if you feel like, ooh, this is a new topic for me or something I want to put on my development plan, I highly recommend the book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader by Jennifer Brown.
Great. Excellent resource. I'm glad that you mentioned that for everyone. Thank you. Hey, listen, Sarah, this has been a great conversation. I so appreciate you coming on today. Tell folks how they can find out more about you and your work.
Thank you again, Michael, for this great opportunity to chat. You can learn more about me and my practice at sarahscala.com. Hopefully, that may end up in the show notes,
Mhm.
as well as my LinkedIn profile. So I'm on LinkedIn as Sarah A. Scala, and I post a few times a week interesting content on inclusion and belonging.
Great, Sarah. Thanks so much. And for me, everyone, I'm Michael Piperno. You can find out more about me at my websites, michaelpiperno.com. And we are Comvia, COMVIA.com as well. And I'm also active on LinkedIn. You can reach me there. So, Sarah, again, thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciated our conversation, as always, as I always do when we get together to speak. And maybe, who knows, maybe we'll do a co-facilitated inclusive leadership workshop sometime that we can invite everybody to. That would be blessed. So
Awesome. Thanks again, Michael.
you're welcome.